Book Club. I'm your host, Ryan, and we finally made it. The Ruination novel, Part 3, Chapter 33, and Epilogue. This is the end. It's taken quite a while, but we made it. We made it to this point. It's pretty exciting, but housekeeping up top. For one of the final times, right? Unless you listen to our normal episodes, then you'll constantly hear housekeeping there. But alas, you can listen to us everywhere. Email us at podcastcore@gmail.com. Remember, that's podcast COR. Visit us at podcastcore.com for all of our info. Follow us on all the platforms. We appreciate it. That helps us. And then leave a like and comment wherever you listen. But the easiest way is word of mouth, to tell a friend, to never surrender to darkness by listening to the Casuals of Runeterra podcast. So this is going to be a long one. I think we've saved up enough energy to really dig into wrapping up this book since it's been a long time coming. So let's get to it. The Ruination has begun. Chapter 33. There's a ton of scenes, so we'll have a little bit of mystery here because we'll keep going and going. But we start with scene 1. We have Ehrlich rushing up the spiral staircase, trying to escape the madness he's witnessing going on at the Well of Ages. And then a blast hits him like a hurricane, and he's just completely obliterated. And Ehrlich Grail is no longer around. And this blast continues, instantly vaporizing everything it touches, and massive pieces of this tower are exploding out, showering over Helia, demolishing everything it comes into contact with, these large stones. And Ladros is laying there, slowly drifting in and out of consciousness on his last leg, while he's staring at a blank-eyed, dead Callista as the blast turns towards them and turns them into nothing. And then Nuno is standing near the docks where you think you could escape, but he knows he can't. He just watches this damnation come towards him and is overtaken as well by the devastation. And we move on to scene 2. Scene 2 here is going to take the record for the longest scene we've ever done. We jump over to Rise in the group, and Rise is scanning the docks looking for the Daggerhawk, but he can't tell them apart from the other ships, right? He doesn't know what he's looking for. And then he sees one ship sailing towards the Howled Mist, and he immediately thinks, holy crap, that's our ride. And then there's this flash in the sky that catches his attention, which is the moment we just talked about. And once his vision returns, he looks over to Tyrus, and he can see in Tyrus's eyes fear for the first time he's ever seen it truly in his eyes. If you know, they've been traveling the world on all these adventures together, and Tyrus is a very capable figure too. So when that guy is like, oh shit, you know something's going on. And Tyrus can only say, God, what have they done? And they were knocked down then by the residuals of this blast because it hasn't reached them yet. And they're almost held in place, like they can't move forward or run or anything like that because there's essentially an earthquake happening under them. So they can't get a footing. And then Rise notices he couldn't see the tower anymore. The tower is no longer there. And usually that tower is so tall, because remember, it's built with magic, that it can be seen from everywhere within the city. And all he could see now was this blue-green energy rushing to them unnaturally fast. And then they saw Hecarim, and on his horse rushing as fast as he can towards them, but even he couldn't outmatch the speed of this blast. And then Tyrus yells, get close to me. We're going to see something we've seen before from Tyrus. If you remember, his magic has like a holy tinge to it, and he does pull magic, not from within himself like Rise, but from sigils on him. So they get close to him as possible, and everybody kind of turns away, and they clutch the kids. But Rise doesn't really know if this is going to work, so he decides to face the blast and keep his eyes open. He refuses to close his eyes. And the moment the blast collides with them, a blinding light shields them, and the only thing sensory he can feel are the sounds of thousands of screaming souls of agony and horror rushing by them. And the sound and the light fade, And then Rise sees Tyrus exhausted and the sigil around his neck glowing brightly. But around them now, the city is completely in ruin. There's nothing there. There's no buildings. It's just gone. Everything is destroyed. So Rise looks out to the harbor and he notices the ships were destroyed, like the buildings. So how are they going to get away? They could see the blast continuing to go on and on and on along the water until ultimately it hit the hallowed mist. Because you remember, you got to use the waystones to get to the hallowed mist. And Jendakaya looks to him and she's like, "Is it over?" But Rise had the feeling it wasn't. So as he's looking at the mist is growing darker and blacker. And there's a storm starting to brew within it. And then the mist, like a blanket, just falls and begins rushing back towards them. So it's not the same as the blast, it's a different type of energy, but it looks unholy. It looks inhuman as it's crawling back towards them. And as it's returning, he's noticing the ships that were just destroyed in the harbor are now being reversed. And they're being reversed not completely to what they were before, but what they were right before the blast happened, moments before. So they're twisted in a way. And the buildings that it's passing near the pier are also doing the same thing, where they look different, but they are standing, and some pieces of stone are floating above other pieces unnaturally. And all they could do at this point, because Tyrus is out of energy, is duck and cover and hope for the best. And as they duck and cover, this mist rushes over them, and Rise mentions that he could feel all the warmth being sucked from his body and the life force being sucked from his body. But after it passed, they looked and they survived. But Helia was now back, sort of. Now it's twisted and it's covered in this dark, dank black mist that you can barely see through. And Jendakaya mentioned something. She's like, "I don't think we're alone anymore." And in the distance, they could see people who were restored as well in a very ghostly way. And Rise immediately notices the similarities between the shades that he saw and the ghouls at the Well of Ages when he went with Ehrlich and the ones here. So he's like, okay, this isn't good. So dread on top of dread on top of dread. It continues to build. Unfortunately, it doesn't get better from here because Rise suddenly notices that there's one familiar figure in the distance. It's this hulking man who's been merged with his steed. And he locked his attention on Rise as if he knew Rise was looking at him. And he began to charge. And the group wasted no time running, and they follow Rise's lead back into the rebuilt city. So the beast follows them in pursuit. And even though JK has her relic weapons along with her assistants and they're blasting at it, some shots are hitting, but they're not taking it down. It's just not enough damage to stop its momentum. It's massive. And Rise is used to navigating the city, so they're following his lead. They continue to weave through buildings and alleyways, and soon they end up barricading themselves in a building for a short time. The beast gets there, starts smashing on the door, and it gets in, but struggles to move within this confined space since it's way too large. So it retreats and tries to find a way around to meet him on the other end, right? So Rise takes his chance and he mentions, "We can reach the docks, follow me." And since they're close, as they make it out of that building on the other through the other door, out into the clearing, they all felt the same sense of dread once again as they noticed what had happened. All the ships on this side have also have been reassembled during the returning mist, but so were the crews that were on those ships, and they stood there looking at them maliciously, waiting. What are your options? And that's where scene 2 ends. So scene 3, much shorter scene, we go back to Ehrlich, looking around and looking at his new ghostly form. He has a skeleton face, sharp teeth, wink wink, nod nod. He looks at the remade Will of Ages, and now it's filled with this black sludge with a film of black mist sitting on top of it. And he moves up the now floating stairs of the tower, and he comes across the spirit of Bardic. And he immediately recognizes Grail, and without hesitation, Grail jumps on him and strikes him with his sickle. And Bardic dissipates into this rattling sphere on the point of Grail's weapon. Grail materializes a skeleton lantern as if it was second nature, and he places the sphere inside of it. And he could see as he looks into this lantern the actual soul of Bartik struggling in horror and fear as he's trapped inside. And he's pleased by this newfound power. Finally, what he's felt inside is now his outside. And he decided that at that moment, Erlich Grail died in that blast. And now there only remains Thresh. And he begins to laugh with pleasure. And this takes us to scene 4. Now, scene 4, we're back with the group. They're standing near the docks. Obviously, there's no other option. It feels like they've tried everything. And the spirits are slowly surrounding them. Tyrus assumes that they're being drawn in by the life essence. And that's how they're tracking what ostensibly is the only life on the island at the moment. And then the spirits begin to attack, and the group goes into fight or flight mode. And the assistants pull out relic weapons and they start to go to work. And during this spree, Rise thinks of another plan. He looks out into the water and he notices a Camavorian ship that's heading into open water. Remember that the mist is no longer there. And Rise told Tyrus he wanted him to trust the plan and begins flipping through that Icathian book of runic sorcery. That kind of is the reason we're in this situation. And he begins preparing. And the half knight, half horse beast appears again from the other side of that building, galloping towards them. And they blasted at him again. They turned all their attention and all the relic weapons on him, and it keeps charging, it keeps charging. And one of Jendikai's assistants, Piotr, then steps forward with his massive relic hammer, and as the knight comes in, turns his attention to him, goes in for the strike, he swings his hammer with all of his might. There's a large blast of light, and actually knocks it down to the cobblestone, but he's cut down. And he falls to the ground. Jendikai and her assistant are obviously tortured by this, but they know nothing can be done. And shocked by their sacrifice, they know he did it to buy them time. Rise begins to build and build power. More power than he's ever tried to control, right, up to this point. And he starts repeating in his head, I feel the soil beneath my hands. I feel the soil beneath my hands. I feel the soil beneath my hands, to try to maintain control. Remember, this is his mechanism for controlling the build of power. And suddenly a runic circle surrounds them, almost like the prison he's used on opponents before, but it's different. And it begins to spin and spin faster and faster and faster. And the giant knight is now up, and he's charging a second time. And as he swings his glaive at the group, poof, they're gone. They're no longer there. And that's where scene 4 ends. On to scene 5. On the Daggerhawk, there's a circle, burning runes that appear on the deck, and they're spinning. And Venix and her crew point their weapons in its direction until figures begin to materialize in a circle with the energy around them, and the light fades, and she sees the children first and immediately commands her men to stand down, and then she sees Rise as he falls to his knees from exhaustion. Venix also recognizes Tyrus there, and then she mentions, holy crap, you guys are here, but not quite out of the woods yet. They look out into the water, and on top of the water, the Spectral Knights, led by Hecarim, are charging straight towards them. And Jendikai and her assistants, her remaining assistant, immediately turn, and they start firing in the direction of the Knights. Venix goes to Jendikaya, and she's like, what are those? Can I grab one? And Jendikai's like, I mean, you can use it as like a melee weapon. It might do some damage, but to teach you how to shoot this would take months for you to learn and to attune to using one of these. So Venix is like, all right, I'll take my chances. Picks one up, thinks back to when she spoke to Callista when she was able to use the Waystone, and shouts, shoot, you bastard. And then a torrent of light fires, completely consuming one knight with just her weapon. And JK is stunned, but she's like, all right. And they get to blasting, and the 3 women are just firing into this wave of knights, picking them off one by one. And finally, from all the damage from the first encounter with Hecarim, from all the damage with the second encounter with Hecarim, from all the damage on the docks before they teleported to Hecarim, and on top of that, with this current barrage, he finally has taken enough damage where he swings away from the conflict, turns back around, and heads back to the island, and his knights follow him. They've made it out of the woods, and Venix, with little hope after all this, finally able to talk to the survivors. She's asking, where's Callista? Is she coming? Did she find a different way out? No one's really responding. They just have these grim looks on their face, and she can tell from that that's her answer. And Venix, a tear comes down, and then more tears. Then she's crying uncontrollably, and then she says, "You better bloody make sure that you're worthy of her sacrifice." And that ends scene 5 and takes us to scene 6. Scene 6 starts with the sound of the word betrayer being said. Callista's eyes open. She stands there, looking at her form, and she looks down and sees the glaive still in her chest. She pulls it out of her chest, notices there's still a ghostly image of the weapon, tries to pull it out again. There's nothing there. So then she notices she has no flesh, and also she wasn't breathing. And then she hears Ladros' voice, and that catches her attention. But when she looks, he looks just like her. Charred armor, ghostly appearance, talons for hands or for fingers. And she also notices when she looks at him the twisted destruction in the distance of the island. And all the spirits of her host are standing there in the same condition, awaiting an order, awaiting a command. And as she's taking this all in, she hears that saying again in the distance, betrayer. And she doesn't know where this voice is coming from. She looks at Ladros. Ladros is like, I don't hear anything. What are you talking about, Cal? And she looks at the damnation around her and she decides, whatever happened, we'll fix it. We'll undo it together. We can still do this. And then she begins to remember Viego and begins to get angry. And it begins to build and it starts to affect her form. And then she hears that word again, betrayer, continue to echo in her mind. And then she thought about Hecarim, and the rage continues to build, and a ghostly spear begins to manifest in her back. And with that spear, she's feeling pain despite having no flesh, despite not breathing. And along with that, she starts to think about all the other people that have betrayed her. Nuno, Pharos, Erlich Grail, all of the others through this whole story. And each person, as she thinks about them, a spear appears in her back and the pain along with that. And Ladros is trying to get her attention, and all she says is betrayers, all of them. And Ladros is trying to get her attention and saying, hey, Cal, stay with me. Don't give in to whatever's happening. Don't give in to it. Stay with me. And some of the Iron Order begins to appear. And this lights a fire in her eyes, like a literal baleful green fire in her eyes. And a spear this time manifests in her hand. And Ladros is like, stay with me, Cal. We can fight them together. And she's losing it. She doesn't know who said that. And he keeps saying, stay with me. And she's like, who is that? I can't remember who they are. And relishing the thought, she's like, okay, whatever. Takes off, throws a spear at one of the knights, immediately downing them. And then another spear appears in her hand. And the host begin to take action. They lower their spears, preparing to fight. And Callista just howls at the top of her lung, now lost in rage. Death to all betrayers. And that takes us to scene 7. So scene 7, we go back to Rise on the ship, and he's watching the ruins of Aaliyah in the distance, and he's just feeling guilt. He feels shame, he feels remorse because he played a big part in all this happening. And he's completely drained at this point. He knew this event, though, would change his life. He would never be the same person again. And he thought about how during their quote-unquote heist, Erlich related to him and told him that he saw some of him in Rise. And Rise swore to himself at that moment to never, ever be driven by ambition again. And he wondered this, and Jendakaya was standing next to him unknowingly, overhearing him speaking out loud. And she said all they can do now, all they could do next, is what Venix mentioned. Don't make her sacrifice in vain. Make it worth it. and they would all have to figure out what that meant to each of them. And then he asked what she was going to do. And she said she would start an order of sentinels, and they would come back as many times as needed to clean up this mess. And although it's a monumental task, she decided she was going to dedicate her life to it, and she had to start somewhere. So now Rise is sitting there alone, and he's thinking about the millennia of the Blessed Isles' existence, all the history and the lore and the mythos that it caused. But he knew this was the end of the Blessed Isles. It was no longer that, it was something different. And to him, this twisted place could only be the Shadow Isles. And with that acknowledgement, he stood up, turned away, and walked away from the sight of the Shadow Isles. And that's it. That's where the book ends. But we get a little bit more. We get an epilogue here. So let's get into that. Epilogue. So we fast forward 30 years later, and we have a letter from Jendikaya herself. She speaks about her relationship with Venix and how even to this point they are together. She is her partner, and even against her wishes, that now as an old woman, she wanted Venix, who is a Vestaya, right? So she doesn't age like humans, to leave her, right, in her old age. She didn't want her to see Jendikaya get old and decrepit because Venix was still the same Venix, right? Youthful, full of energy, and Jendikaya just can't keep up. But she also brings up in this letter Tyrus and his position and him giving up on the Blessed Isles because something major happened that overtook the event of the Blessed Isles that was caused by the Ruination itself, which we've spoken about. It's the Rune Wars. This was something he decided to dedicate himself to because it resulted in the deaths of millions, and he took Rise with him. So Jendikaya seems to be the only one still on this mission to clean up the mess at the now Shadow Isles. And she's led multiple missions back to the Shadow Isles to try to undo the curse slowly, step by step. And they've recovered some relic weapons, which have helped. They've recovered other artifacts that are important to the history. And the main problem here is that returning to the Shadow Isles, and this was kind of shown to us when the initial blast happened, or when the secondary blast happened after it hit the mist, is that when you're on the Shadow Isles in the black mist, it does drain you of life force, just slowly. So every time you return, you're aging faster, which explains why Jendikaya, who was relatively young at the beginning of the story, or at the point in the story where we met her, is aging so fast in 30 years because she keeps going back. But the Sentinels have grown. They've grown to a legitimate organization. And the message and the idea of why the Sentinels exist has also grown. And she no longer is needed for this mission to continue, and she's content with that. So they will continue to fight and undo the horrors of the Ruination through everywhere it touches. They've also done really well at resisting the black mist wherever it tries to spread, because it's no longer contained within the Shadow Isles. It's trying to make its way around, and obviously listen to all of our episodes related to the Ruination and Sentinels of Light to get more details on it specifically where. But at this point, they're now in the phase of building a main base, a building, an outpost that will house all the weapons for safekeeping and also the knowledge of what the Sentinels are so that it can continue to live on outside of mortal forms. And she leaves us with this line to wrap this up. It says, "All may be dark right now, but there is still an ember of hope. And one day soon, that ember will become a flame, and the darkness will finally be banished. Sentinel, Artificer, Jendikaya." And that's where we are. That's it. That's been Ruination by Anthony Reynolds. So, uh, hats off. I think I've told you all step by step this long book club journey that we've taken our time with. We're done. what an experience. I did not expect it. I expected it to be fine. I didn't expect it to be this good. Um, we'll talk more about this. The story's done, but there is one more episode. Because I got to bring my boy back, right? Hetch has to come on, and we're going to talk about our final thoughts on all of this as people who've been following the lore for so long, right? I mean, over a decade at this point, right? And how well we think Anthony Reynolds has done with piecing this history together. Because essentially what this is, we knew the outcome, but ultimately I think he was able to make the journey just as pleasurable. So with that, it's been a long episode. Thank you for all of the time you've spent not only listening to these episodes, because this is not even our main content, but all the time you spent waiting for these episodes. I'm not delusional about that patience, so I appreciate it. So I leave you with this as always. Thanks for listening. We'll be back soon with the next episode. And as Hetch always says, take care, everybody.